You are all part of something much bigger than just looking around the room where you are now, either here or in Prescott or in Phoenix. You are part of an organization that has about 80 affiliates around the country, that has been instrumental in the history of funeral consumer rights with the Federal Trade Commission and the Funeral Rule, that is active in working with state legislators to preserve the rights of funeral consumers. We're working with Ron Adair and some other funeral directors right now on some legislation in this state that we believe would harm consumers to the benefit of large corporate entities. So you are really part of I don't know, Josh, around 300,000 members around the country, give or take?
Yeah.
So if you look around here and you think, well, where are the other 4,000 members in the Tucson area, or the other 1,000 areas in the Phoenix area, or 1,000 areas in people in the Prescott area, know that, well, folks have other things to do because they know that the organization is in good hands with a great board. If you are interested in being on the board, let us know. Write in your name here, or when we come to that portion of the business session after Josh speaks, then let us know. Nominate yourself. That's how we picked up. Ron Mumford, and he's just been a treasure. So if you're a treasure, let us know. So again, I thank you very much for coming, and it is my privilege now to introduce Joshua Slocum. He is our national. Go ahead, give him a round of applause. For some reason, and I'm sure Josh will tell you why, he became absolutely enamored of the death and dying industry at a very young age. And he's been working for our organization now for 12 years. And when Lisa Carlson left the organization, Josh was her right-hand guy. The current board selected Josh as the executive director, and it's not a decision that I have regretted in my 6.5 years on the national board. Josh has a depth of knowledge about the funeral industry that I would doubt that anybody else in the country can rival. And when we had this merger, I thought, who would be a better speaker than my good friend, Josh Slocum, because he is both entertaining and informative. So I give you Joshua Slocum.
We are gathered here to put the fun back in funerals. So if you don't want to have a good time, you should probably leave right now. Oh, one other order of business. Is there anyone here who is not a member of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Arizona? Okay. Mr. Adair, our funeral director, will meet you with a hearse around the back side, and we can arrange something. You will either be leaving as a member or you will be leaving horizontally.
Because there are membership applications, orange ones on the back here.
Well, Ruth introduced you to some of the basics about our national federation that you are a part of, so I'm not going to go any further into that, but instead, we're going to go right to Ms. Crawford, who is not at all pleased about our meeting today. As Ruth said, I was a newspaper reporter around the year 2000. Right after I'd graduated from college, I found myself just in newspaper work. And I was a cops and crime reporter. So I was basically the newspaper's ambulance chaser. I had a police scanner on my desk and a cell phone in those days, a bag with a box with a phone that I took with me and the scanner in my 1975 forest green Dodge Dart. Yes. I was so into the cub reporter thing. But we had something called weekend stories, which is editors speak for, we're going to get your money, we're going to get your work out of you even on the days when you're off. So in addition to covering fires and crimes and such, I needed to find a feature article on a story off of my beat to file to run in the Sunday edition. And somebody slipped a copy of Jessica Mitford's famous 1963 book, The American Way of Death, on my desk. And I do not exaggerate when I tell you that I stayed up all night long until dawn reading this book, alternating between laughing so hard I had to go get a glass of water and saying, how the hell do these guys get away with this stuff? I found it absolutely fascinating that there was such a thing as the American funeral industry. And that industry, depending on how you want to slice it up, funeral homes, cremation, cemetery burials, we're talking about between $15 and $20 billion a year that Americans spend on death. And we have participated in, and as consumers helped create, along with the funeral industry, a whole set of ideas about how to properly and rightly bury the dead. And I call this mortuary mythology. And have you even read Mitford's book, The American Way of Death? Okay, I'm serious, folks. If you haven't, really, do go get it. It is hysterically funny. Jessica Mitford was of the famous Mitford family in England. I'm sorry? Did somebody? Okay. Sort of, I guess you would say they were a family of peerage living in reduced circumstances. Her sister was a Nazi sympathizer. Jessica became a radical socialist and married San Francisco labor lawyer Robert Truhaft, who began noticing how union members' death benefits were being sucked right out of widows' pocketbooks and into the hands of the undertaker. And she was very famous in her writing style. I mean, the prose in this book is so good that it is still regularly taught in basic English composition classes, despite the subject matter. So it's really, really funny. And I would be lying to you if I said I didn't have a lot of fun doing this job. I am very committed to our mission. I think that we have a social justice mission and an economic justice mission in protecting Americans and families from all walks of life from making decisions that may harm them financially or that they may regret later when they are under pressure and at a time of grief. But I also like absurdity, and there's a lot of absurdity here. And one of the first face-to-face or phone-to-phone encounters I remember where I really got a personal sense of how weirdly we think about death was a phone call in, I think, the spring of 2003 when I was at the office still working under Lisa Carlson. And I had a call from a lady who had pre-bought a mausoleum space for her and her husband at a mausoleum in a huge cemetery in Florida. They were Jewish. So they were not interested in cremation. But it turns out they had moved back to Wisconsin, where they came from in their later years, which they hadn't anticipated. I mean, most people don't move back north, right? I would, because I kind of like the cold a little bit. You know, keeps me young. So they weren't quite sure what to do, but when her husband died, they knew that they actually did want to bury him in this space. So she called the cemetery in Florida, remember she's in Wisconsin, and said, what do I have to do to get my husband down here? He's died. And the cemetery said, oh, well, the law requires that you embalm him. Not true. The law requires that you buy an 18-gauge sealed casket. Not true. And she didn't want any of this stuff. Of course, the Jewish religion frowns on embalming. And there's no advantage to an 18-gauge casket. When you hear about casket gauges, it's metal thickness. So the higher the number, the thinner the metal. So a 20-gauge is a really lightweight, an 18-gauge is a medium weight. The only people who can tell the difference are your accountant and the pallbearers. They all look exactly the same. And there's no point in, sealing people in them. Well, I knew something that apparently the cemetery didn't. There is a thing called exploding casket syndrome. I'm not making it up. This is when you buy a sealed casket and you put a person in it and you slide them into the wall in the mausoleum. In a warm climate, nature takes its course and the body liquefies and gas builds up and can blow the front of the crypt off. And yes, it's real. Yes, I have seen it. It's not made up. So I called the cemetery and I said to his name, I'll never forget, his name was Mr. Baguette, like the bread. And I said to him, I'm Josh Slocum, I'm with Funeral Consumers. can you tell, what are these laws that require the body be embalmed in a sealed casket before you put him in the mausoleum? Well, those are the laws with the state of Florida, blah, blah, blah. I already knew. I gotta tell you folks, rule of thumb, anytime somebody tells you that something is either required by law or prohibited by law, PIX or it didn't happen. Make them bring the citation, because 9 times out of 10, there is no such law. There's a lot of misunderstanding. So I finally got this cemetery manager to admit that there was no such Florida law. Oh, well, I was referring to the cemetery's bylaws, which we have filed with the state of Florida. He said, sir, I can't imagine, if I were a mausoleum operator in Florida, why I would allow a sealed casket, let alone require one. And he said, well, why is that? And so I went into a slightly more colorful version of the exploding casket syndrome that I just talked to you about. And he said to me, I have been here for 22 years, and during that time, we have never experienced that problem, despite the fact that I personally have supervised having moved several of our patients to different locations. So, of course, I have the phone here and I'm going, did you say patients? Yes, sir, our patients. And he said, well, you have a damn good cryptside manner. This is part of what makes this job so fun is puncturing pretentiousness and helping people get to what is real and what's valuable to them, both economically and emotionally and spiritually in funerals. But it takes a lot of breaking through our ideas about mortuary mythology. And, you know, it's been 12 years now, and we get thousands of calls in our office and thousands of emails. And I have decided that what we Americans do, we don't die, of course. We pass away. We get lost. When I read the obituary pages and I see that somebody's been lost, I swear I want to ask them if they've checked the couch cushions. I mean, you can't believe the stuff I found there. It's a $20 bill last week, actually, when I was cleaning up cat hair. And I have what we call death in the subjunctive mood. And this is when someone calls, and it's probably somebody like you, or somebody that you know, or your daughter or son. Funeral Consumers Alliance, can I help you? Well, I don't need your services today, but if anything should ever happen, or, you know, if I were to have a problem, you're gonna die. You know that, right? Or, and Ruth will back me up on this. Second most favorite call? Member calls. Yeah, I'm a member of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Southern Arizona. Who do I call when I die? So you know that old Twilight Zone episode with the widow? And she keeps getting scratchy calls from her dead husband, and then the final scene is when they wheel her out to the cemetery and you see the broken phone line is down over his grave. That's what I think of every time. Wah, wah. So let me test your knowledge a little bit. How many of you here are interested for yourselves in cremation? How many of you are interested for yourselves in burial? Okay. How many of you here brought a grown adult child with you? I'm going to ask the rest of you. How many of you all have children? Where are they? Why aren't your kids here? Okay. Those of you who have kids or family here, why aren't they here with you? You know what? I'm so glad that you're members, because you're going to be better off when your funeral comes along, or your family is. The people who get the benefit of membership are not you. You are not going to know how well or how poorly we do for you when you die. It's going to make no difference. It's your kids. And when this organization was first founded as a national group from the locals in 1963, it was not, as the stereotype goes these days, an old people's club. It was formed by professionals and activists in their 30s and 40s. The people who need The benefits of your membership the most are your middle-aged family members who are going to be burying or cremating you sooner rather than later. And I would like to invite you to press your family members and press your children, and do not take no for an answer. I actually had a phone call one day from a couple who wanted to talk about sensible funeral and burial planning. The missus said to me, send us this literature, but we figured we had to do something because our children just won't be able to handle this. It'll be too difficult for them at the time of death. Well, caption, hold that for a second. The next day, her daughter calls and says, I really wish you'd send me some information because I just know this will be too difficult for my parents to talk about. I'm not making this up. We live our lives by telling stories about who we are and who our loved ones are and what we can handle and what we don't. So much of what we do is absolutely arbitrary. It's because we've told ourselves a certain story. And the story that we've told ourselves, and that many of you in this room have also told yourselves, is that it'll just be too hard for your kids and you need to make sure everything is taken care of. Some of you may have seen this. It's in the public domain. What do you think of when I say the words traditional funeral? Think about that for a moment. When I say we're just going to have a traditional funeral, then I'd like a couple of you to volunteer to tell me what you think of when you hear that phrase. Yes?
Catholic funeral with a rosary.
Catholic funeral with a rosary, open casket, probably followed by a graveside ceremony with a hearse. Okay? Same for you. Is that what everybody thinks of? A wake, flowers, viewing the body. This is a traditional American funeral. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the commercial, what Jessica Mitford called the commercial burlesque, that we have decided is the way to go. I'm not going to make a value judgment here, and I'm not going to tell you what I think you ought to do or ought not to do, because that is not our job. But I do want to shake up your definitions, and I want you to change the story that you tell yourselves a little bit. Before the Civil War, there was no such thing as the funeral industry per se. You had the undertaker, who was ordinarily or usually the furniture maker or cabinet maker on Main Street. You look at old photographs, even in some towns in Vermont, there's still a sign up on a storefront that says, Johnson and Son Furniture and Undertaking, right? I mean, obviously, for historical purposes, but that was normal. The undertaker undertook to help the family. His job was usually to bring extra chairs, to bring the coffin, either one that he had built in stock, or they would actually come out to the home with the body, which was on your kitchen table. Yes, your family would have done this too. It wasn't weird. Measure the body, make the coffin. The family cared for the body. Usually, as is the case in these things, the women of the household were the ones doing the caregiving and washing the body and shrouding it. And the body was placed in the parlor, and people came and they ate food and they had the funeral there. And then the body was loaded onto the wagon and they walked to the cemetery, to the churchyard. This is a pioneer family in the 1800s, and the only concession to commercial practices we have here is that commercial coffin that was bought. That's really, they probably spent more on that than they spent on anything else. They're all wearing their Sunday best. Undoubtedly, that is the one good suit of clothes that each of them has. That baby was born at home, that baby died at home, and that baby is being waked at home. Much closer connection to death. How many of you are aware that photographing the dead was a common and ordinary thing in the late 19th century? Guess what? It was. Postmortem photography. Remember, when photography was in its infancy, it was an extremely expensive process, as all new technology is. And many families could only afford to have a portrait done once or twice in a lifetime. And one of the most important times is when a person had died, and they wanted to remember that. I mean, you have to think for a moment. Think about a world where there was no such thing as everything being photographed. There was no Google. There wasn't even Life magazine that could give you pictures of Sri Lanka. This was a technological miracle of memories for people, and it really caught their attention. This one on the left, the daughter in the middle is deceased. Her eyes are intentionally open. They often posed the deceased to look lifelike, and if they could not do so, they would retouch the glass plate and paint the eyes open. Not all the time, but it was common. Mother and child dead in childbirth. Very common, sad scene. But when I show these to people, or if you go online, there are lots of websites that curate sort of niche interests in Victoriana and mourning. And the first time people see this, they're shocked and they say, oh, how grotesque or how morbid, or how could they do that? I'm here to tell you folks that what we consider grotesque, morbid, dignified, holy, sanctified, atrocious, all of it, every last bit of it is subjective, arbitrary, and culturally and historically bound. If you find this distasteful, I guarantee you that if you were alive 130 years ago, you would not have the same feelings, because everyone else is telling the story that this is what we do when we die. So I ask people to stop when they hear something that seems weird to them, and remember what we do with the dead here in 21st century America and in 20th century America is a radical departure from what we did before, and from what most of the rest of the world does. Embalming came about because of the Civil War and the discovery of embalming with soluble, at that point, arsenic, which is a wonderful preservative, not so nice for living people, to get the soldiers from the battlefield back home. And it very quickly coalesced into a trade. Undertakers who learned embalming, and they learned them from the chemical companies. The mortuary schools in this country, they were founded by the chemical companies. This was not academia, folks. This is trade school, and it's marketing. And they very quickly realized that they had a product that would sell. Abraham Lincoln's funeral train took 12 days across the country with his body embalmed on public display, and people had never seen the like of it. Could not believe he wasn't decaying. You can imagine that as people moved off the farm and into the city, had smaller houses, less extended family, you could well imagine there would be a place there for a professional class of undertakers to rise up and take some of those responsibilities away. But in so doing, this didn't just evolve naturally. We completely ceded control of our dead to the commercial funeral industry, to the point where most people that I talk to believe that it is actually illegal for you to care for your own dead, to be your family's own undertaker. Most people believe you are legally required to hire a funeral home when mom dies. How many of you believed that before you just heard me say that? Right. And I'm not saying that to chide you. I'm saying it to wake you up. What if I told you that when little Johnny, your son, had a bad case of the flu and you took him into the hospital and he was there for 3 days, finally ready to be discharged, what would you think if the hospital discharge staff said to you, oh, I'm sorry, madam, we can't release little Johnny to you. You have to hire a state-certified medical transport service. You think that's ridiculous. That would never happen, and you're right. You should think it's ridiculous when they say that about your dead, too. What if your husband dies in the hospital and you decide, I cared for him in life, I cared for him during his illness, and I want to care for him in death? And the hospital says to you, I'm sorry, madam, we can't release your husband's body to you. It's a liability issue. I'm not saying that you should want to do this. I want you to think about it because I think it's brain expanding. But I do want you to question why we would think that was okay. Why is it okay that we should have any situation where we are compelled by law to hire a third-party business to do something that may be one of the most intimate family rituals and most important times in our life? So that, my friends, is a traditional American funeral. And that's what I mean when I talk about mortuary mythology. Almost everything you think you know about death, dying, and funerals in terms of logistics, you all are more educated than the average person, of course, because you're members of this organization, you get the newsletter. But a lot of you are walking around with mortuary mythology in your head, too. As an example, here's things that almost everybody believes that are not true. There is no state in the United States, none of the 50 states require embalming for a viewing of the body. None. Never have, ever. Except Minnesota, which we got changed in 2007. No state in the country requires a casket as a condition of being buried in the ground. No state in the country legally requires a concrete vault as a condition of ground burial. No state requires embalming as a condition of burial in a mausoleum or in the ground. But I'm betting some of you believed at least a few of those things were true. And the reason you do is because the only people that you get your information from is the guy who has something to sell you. When we go shopping for a car, we'll do a little audience participation. Those of you, this is for folks who are not members of the FCA. I'll have questions for members too. The last funeral in your family, who are the non-members again, please? Okay, a couple of you. Have you ever arranged, have you been the point person in arranging a funeral? Oh, okay, but you have, ma'am. When that happened, you remember the funeral home you used? Do you remember why you picked that funeral home? Do you mind sharing?
Well, it was recommended to our family through the hospital.
Recommended by the hospital. Okay.
They gave us a list.
They gave you a list. Okay. Most people, I don't have enough non-members in here to make this work, so I'm just going to talk it out. Most people, when you ask them, the most common reason that they pick a funeral home over another funeral home, can you guess why? Pardon?
All in the family.
All in the family? It's because they used it before. Just because they used it before. Almost nobody ever shops around for funerals. When you buy a car, what would you say if your girlfriend said to you, oh, well, you know, we always get our cars from Heritage City Ford because that's the dealership that my grandfather used to go to and then my father went to. That's our family's dealership. You'd think she was stupid or a little bit foolish. We don't do that, right? We don't say, this is my family's car dealership or this is my family's appliance dealer necessarily. When we look for a car, we're going to compare prices and models and sales practices among different dealerships. You've taught your kids how to do this. When I bought my first car, I saved up my money, and oh, did I think I was riding on top of the world with a 4-speed Dodge Reliant K station wagon, camel colored, that I paid $1,200 for. My mother said, you save up the money, I will show you how to shop for a car. And she took me around and we went to the various used car dealerships. Most of you have done something like this with your kids, either with credit cards or comparing banks and credit unions, any of these things. But most of you have not done this. You don't even know how to do it for yourselves at a funeral home, and you sure as heck have not done it for your children. I want you to do it for your children. We send our kids out into the world with life skills because we know that mommy and daddy can't be there all of little Susie's life. So we show little Susie how to balance a checkbook. We talk about what her rights might be as a tenant in a contract. We say, if you're looking for a credit card, here's some good ones, here are some tricky ones to avoid. We do these basic things, but we stop when it comes to funerals. And we put little Susie back in kindergarten. And we say, I know that it'll be too difficult for them and they can't make decisions at a time of stress, so mommy and daddy went down to the mortuary and we talked to the nice man there and everything's taken care of. If you ever catch yourself ever saying everything's taken care of, please have a seat and have a glass of ice water and rethink it, because there is no such thing as everything taken care of. You cannot everything taken care of. You can't make sure that Susie will have no decisions. You cannot prepay away any possibility that you might die in Alaska on vacation instead of St. Petersburg, Florida. What your survivors need, and what I should also say this, I'm speaking, when I say family and children, I want you to hear whoever your closest, most precious people are. Your chosen family, your married family, or your blood family. I mean this expansively. They are going to have to make decisions. It doesn't matter what the nice man at the mortuary says about, you know, lock in today's prices and all this sort of stuff. Your kids will have to make decisions. They will have to sign paperwork. And you know what? They can do it. And I wish I'd remember this lady's name, but I talk this way with consumers on the phone who call me. We have a policy in my small office of 3 staff that we are candid and direct. We are not cruel, and we're not crass, but we are candid. And sometimes we do crack a joke, because sometimes a grieving person needs to hear it. Sometimes they don't. But we don't use euphemisms, and we don't talk around the subject. And we tell people exactly what their legal rights are. We remind them that you cannot show love and respect for the deceased by the amount of money you spend. Whether it's $10 to get a certificate and donate the body to science, or $10,000 on a burial, grandma is still dead. She's going to stay dead. You're still going to miss her. You're still going to love her. And whatever you serve at the funeral repast is going to taste just as good or just as terrible. So love and money are not the same thing. And I've had so many people call and say, you know, I can't really afford this kind of funeral, or this doesn't work for us, but my community expects this. And I said, well, then your community better bring out its checkbook. There is no moral or ethical obligation to do what someone else wants for a funeral, even if it's your mother. I will do what my mother wants because it's practical and I know that I can do it and afford it. But if she asks me for something that I couldn't afford, she's going to get what I can afford and what works for my brothers and sisters emotionally too, right? That's what's important. So in talking about traditional funerals, there is an interesting resurgence in the practice. That gentleman standing over his mother, his name is Roger Erickson. He is a member of our national board. That is his mother. She has died. And that is Donna Belk, who is a woman who educates families and community groups about how to care for the dead, basically restoring the common knowledge that used to be passed down from generation to generation. If you have a child and you've changed diapers, how to change diapers and feed a baby, caring for the dead was that kind of knowledge too. It was ordinary household stuff. It was not arcane, mysterious stuff. This was just stuff you did. They decided that they had cared for Mom in her home, and they were going to care for her in death. And although I don't have all the pictures, you should see the outpouring of family. There were dozens of people there. The children were delighted to take their hands in finger paint and press them on the outside of Mom's, Grandma's homemade casket and write their names. These pictures are full of people who are crying, but who are also laughing and having a hell of a good time because they are saying something personal about Nana, and they are participating in taking care of Nana, even if that just means drawing a little flower on her casket, right? They're not afraid of her because they've been at her bedside. The family's been coming in and out while she's alive. Well, she's simply stopped breathing now, and it's time to take care of her from there. And in the interim, this is Roger and his brother building her casket on that same day. And they're not just smiling, saying cheese for the camera. Roger calls this constructive therapy. He said, this was the best thing. This is a balm for my soul at the moment that I was doing it. And I tell you, you cannot buy grief therapy that is anywhere near as powerful as having something hands-on, personal to do yourself. You know, funeral directors are not bad people by nature. We don't hate them. We don't think that there's something unethical about making a profit caring for the dead. There is not. It is a respectable business, and there are many, many good funeral directors. Our criticism, Ron Adair is an example, your cooperating funeral director here, is fantastic. And I trust him. He's one of many that I trust and will call on when I need advice for something I don't have the expertise in. What we question is the passive nature of how we deal with death and how we assume that we are incompetent, that we will collapse into a puddle of emotional jello on the floor if we see a dead body. I mean, we call funeral homes at 3 in the morning to get the body out of there. Do you know how weird this looks to people in England? I'm serious. They say, what the hell is wrong with you Yanks? Why don't you make a cup of tea, take a couple hours nap, and call the undertakers at 8 in the morning? Yet we get on the phone, hysterical. Get this body out of here now. All of a sudden, your husband becomes a corpse with a capital C. Again, this is learned behavior. This fear is learned. It's not unnatural, it's not abnormal, but it is learned, and you can unlearn it. And I hope all of you will unlearn just a little bit of fear. I don't care if you never carry it through and do a home funeral. That's your business. But I want you to unlearn some of these things you've told yourselves. I found this to be true in a slightly modified form, which is tuna macaroni salad. I have a confession here. I love tuna macaroni salad so much that if it were legal in my state, I would marry it. Okay? This is my family's version of funeral food. I had a party 3 weeks ago. I live in a small working class town outside Burlington, Vermont, where it's the only place in the county where housing prices are affordable for people buying their first home. So my neighbors are all people in their 30s to mid 40s. They're having their first kids. They're really wonderful. And we have kind of a dinner party potluck circuit. And luckily, everybody is a good cook and everybody is fun. So these aren't like these horrible potlucks where people bring some bucket of hummus that they bought at Ralph's, you know. I mean, okay, I've done it too, but I'm not going to admit it. I had a party, it was my turn, and I threw dishes to die for. And I said, bring a dish to pass on. Your favorite funeral, I'm serious, you can do it too, it's hysterical. And I brought some funeral implements, little embalming things like the little eye caps that they keep your eyelids closed, and I put them on little hors d'oeuvre trays, just to get people talking. And we had a hell of a good time. And they all left with a copy of Before I Go, You Should Know, because those folks are all from 30 to 50. They are going to be dealing with funeral directors more than you are, or their parents are, because they're going to be the ones in charge. Tuna macaroni salad. When my grandmother died in 1992, this was the first death of somebody who was close to me. She died of congestive heart failure. She was 76 years old. It was a gentle death. I mean, she was well taken care of in the hospital. She had pain medication. It was a very peaceful death. We were with her, so I saw her as she was dying, and I saw her when she died. And she looked like my grandmother, except a little more pale, and her mouth was hanging open. She looked like a tired old lady, which is what she was. But she looked like my grandmother. 2 days later, at the funeral home, I walked up to the casket. We had to go approve how she looked before the viewing. And I'd never seen a loved one before. I had that mortuary face, Everybody looks like that, no matter what. I went, why don't they go? It scared the bejesus out of me, literally. I was 16 years old, and all the wrinkles were gone from her face. She had this lipstick on. She was almost orange. And I know, because I've seen a lot of embalmed bodies now, that the job they did was considered a good job. This is what one expects when one pays for embalming. This is a matter of taste. I'm not saying don't have embalming if you want it. Absolutely, pickle yourself to death, I don't care. But it scared me. And I touched her. And of course, dead people are gonna be cold, no matter what. They're gonna be cold and they're gonna stiffen a little bit. But formaldehyde really firms up the skin. I mean, it makes it feel like cold, hard. It felt like, you remember the old Naugahyde seats in automobiles and how they'd feel in winter before the car was warmed up? That's what she felt like. And it really frightened me. And I could smell very subtly the formaldehyde. And it completely threw me for a loop. We did this, even though Grandma wanted cremation, by the way, because Grandma had 9 children who lived, and one of them, Aunt Kathy, had not seen her for 15 years. And it was so important for Aunt Kathy to see her that the other sisters decided to go against Grandma's wishes and have an open casket funeral. And for my money, they made the right moral choice, because Aunt Kathy needed that. And Grandma would have understood. So I'm very much in favor of being flexible. Please, 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 don't give dictates from beyond the grave. Do not tell your children what they will do. Ask them what they might need. Guidelines and participation, not mandates, because you may inadvertently put your children or your survivors in an emotional or financial straitjacket. They feel an obligation to carry out your wishes, and they can be very upset if they can't. Ruth, can you give me a signal of when I need to wrap up?
Start heading that direction.
Okay, because I want to leave some time for talks. A couple of things I want to show you for your edification. It's perfectly legal to care for your own dead in Arizona. If you're interested in this in more depth, obviously, You can look at my book, Final Rights. Not only do we have the narrative chapters and the state law chapters, and by the way, this is written as a legal self-help book in plain English. This is not written in lawyerese. It's written so that any intelligent person can understand this. It's written for you, not for a lawyer. Basically, you need a doctor or a medical examiner to sign the death certificate within 72 hours. You fill out the biographical stuff. When the funeral director does it, he's just transcribing what you say on the other side of the desk. That needs to go to Vital Statistics, your registrar, your local health department, and you need to get a permit, a burial transit permit that they will hand back to you that says this body may now be taken to the cemetery. You will have to get a medical examiner's permit if cremation is your preferred choice. And basically, in most states, with the exception of 8, this is all that's required at death, folks. There are not oodles of arcane legal requirements that we all think there are. That's it. You got to record it, it's got to be legally certified, and the body has to be disposed of by donation, cremation, or burial within a reasonable time frame. That's it. It's not rocket science. It really isn't. But, yeah. One problem in Arizona that we're probably going to tackle, and this is something your Funeral Consumers Alliance does that you probably don't know about. We go to administrative offices and the legislature, and we advocate for you. If there is a law that makes it more expensive for you to do business with the funeral industry unnecessarily, or that takes away your rights, we are the ones who go and lobby for you. So when you pay dues and when you contribute to this organization, you are supporting Arizona, but they're supporting us too at the national office. 15% of what you donate comes to support our work at the national level. So, I mean, thank you for being a member both here and for our sake, because we want to go to Congress for you. One of the things we may tackle is some unclear language in the law that makes it difficult for families to work directly with crematories instead of having to go through a funeral home. Families who want home funerals will often say it'll end in cremation. In Arizona, there's some friction there that makes it more costly and actually hampers competition in business too. So these are the kinds of things that Ruth will be telling you about, but that's what your donations are supporting. And just a few reminders, you probably already know this, but the Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule. Most of you probably haven't heard of it in those terms. Remember the funeral rule. This is a rule from the FTC that gives you the right to price quotes by phone from funeral homes, to a printed, itemized price list at the very beginning of your arrangements discussion at the funeral home, no questions asked. You have the right to pick and choose only the goods and services that you want. They may not force you to buy a package. And you have the right, if you wish, to build and bring your own casket. That's a basic synopsis. No matter where you are, you may be traveling outside of Arizona and one of your spouses may die. So you are not necessarily, I mean, Ron is going to take good care, the Adair family is going to take good care of you. But some of you are not going to die here, and you're not going to use Adair, and you need to know how to shop for yourself. I just told you. You're interested in cremation? If you call 5 or 6 funeral or cremation businesses anywhere in the country, anywhere, within a 30-mile radius of where you are, you will find a vast difference in price for a direct cremation. You will find a difference of probably thousands of dollars. So even if you aren't here, remember, we are here to empower you, but we are not one call does it all, okay? Your kids need to know this too, because some of you are going to die someplace else. You can still save money if you're willing to spend 30 to 45 minutes on the phone making those 5 or 6 phone calls. You will save yourself thousands. John?
You can also buy a coffin from Costco or Walmart.
You can. Yep, absolutely. You can build one, you can buy one. And just very quickly, this is from the 2012 price survey. This is the range of prices just here in Tucson. For a direct cremation, you can pay $865 or you can pay $2140 and everything in between. For a simple direct burial, you can pay $1,290 or $3,690. For a full service funeral, the so-called traditional, $1,695 to $5,905. That's before you buy the casket, and that's before you pay the cemetery. This is all within driving distance of your home. Do you see how people get taken advantage of because they don't shop around for funerals the way they do for everything else? You will find this in any American city or any rural area. If I can ask you to bring one thing from this talk today to the people you love, teach them these simple shopping skills. They will feel better. Even if they don't want to hear it at first, they will feel more confident and less fearful. And I want to open this up and ask you folks if you want to ask some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Do you need a casket at all?
Do you need a casket at all? A casket holds the body, at least like a cardboard box prior to cremation, something that's stiff enough to hold the body and get it from one place to another. But there's never a legal requirement for a casket. It may be practically necessary and it may be desirable. Other questions? Yes, ma'am, back there. And a cremation urn? Big enough for 2 bodies? Well, if by bodies you mean ashes. Yeah, actually, generally speaking, and Ron Adair will probably have a more accurate answer for you, generally speaking, cremated human remains about 7 pounds, Ron? So basically something a little bit bigger than what would carry a 5-pound bag of flour will generally work. There will be variations. So think of that and then think of as much space as you need there. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any law, someone told me, and I don't know, if human ashes are mixed with a pet's ashes?
She asked, the question is there any law against mixing human ashes with pet ashes? My answer to that first is, if I told you yes, what would you do?
Well, I already have my pet's ashes.
Well, I say that for a reason. There are no laws against the family themselves commingling the ashes. Funeral homes, we can get into lots of details. You can do what you want with your ashes. If you want your kitty's ashes with you, put them in the urn. You can ask your funeral director, if you do burial, to put the urn in the casket with you. And if you want to bury or scatter ashes on your own property, you are absolutely free to do so. And there are no ashes police, folks. So what I'm saying is, even if there were a law that said you can't, I would say, are you going to let that stop you in your backyard?
No.
Come on.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. It's a good question. It's a very common one. Anyone else? Do you need an urn? Again, you need an urn, you need something to hold the remains to keep them in one place, but anything that will hold them and get them there without spilling will do just fine, be it decorative or plain. Anything you want. You may use a cookie jar. You can use Dad's fishing tackle box. You can use, what does my mother want me to, she's got this 1920s Oreo tin with a finger wave lady going, I must have Oreo sandwich. That's what she wants her ashes to be put in. I'm going to put some cookies in there too. Folks, thank you very much for coming out and talking about death with me on a Saturday morning. I appreciate it.